So today's topic is GMOs. What we need to know, GMOs are sometimes referred to as the largest human experiment. Why is that the case? So first, GMOs are a very, very complicated topic. It's very, very scientific, it's very new, so there's a lot of things that even the scientists who are involved with it on a day-to-day basis still don't understand, still don't know. There's a lot of research that still hasn't been done about it. A certain amount of research has, but there's a lot of things that we just don't know about GMOs. So it's a very controversial topic, and it's a topic that is still very new and hazy, and people are confused about it. Yeah, exactly.
Andre, you may want to say what GMO stands for.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. So GMOs are a subject that is very sensationalized. The people who love GMOs and think it's one of the things that's going to save us in the future love it and talk about it like it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the people who hate GMOs are also very, very fervent about their belief and don't always necessarily speak the truth or bring to light the things that are accurate about GMOs. So it's very sensationalized. It's important for you to know that when you watch documentaries about GMOs or you read articles, what you're reading is not always necessarily the truth. So just be aware of that, and use your common sense to filter through and see what you find to be the truth. So it's just important to be aware of that. GMOs stand for genetically modified organisms. So basically any organism, whether it's us humans or a plant or an animal or an insect, any living organism, if we take their DNA and alter it, then that is a genetically modified organism. And it's something that began as early as 1950, 1960, but it's been a very, very slow process. There's been a lot of discussion about whether we should be doing this at all or not, whether it's safe or not. So it's just been a very slow process. It's also referred to very often as GM, just genetically modified. So you'll see that interchangeably, GMO or GM. So what are the reasons to create GMOs? So the people who are on the plus side, what is it that they say is the reason to go about studying this and trying to create GMOs? So one thing is world hunger. And so they say, well, if we could create crops that produce more yield, that would be great. Or that could grow with less water. So for example, in a desert area, then maybe they could grow crops that right now wouldn't grow. It's also taught very much just to make the farming process easier. So instead of having to weed by hand or have all this complicated machinery, if we create a genetically modified organism that resists pesticides, so we can use pesticides and the plant that we want doesn't die. So there's lots of reasons that they give for developing GMOs. In the agricultural side, there's a completely different issue when it comes to humans and cloning and that kind of stuff. But as far as our food supply is when we're talking about our food supply, that's really what I'm focusing on. So those are some of the reasons that they give. It's just, can we create better crops? Can we make the yields stronger? Can we make the fruits possibly taste better? They give a lot of different reasons. And some of those sound pretty good if they were to accomplish it. So how are GMOs created? Obviously, we imagine that it's a very, very detailed science, that is very precise. because DNA, as we know, is a very, very small thing. And so we imagine that they have these huge microscopes and they're going in with these robotic hands and splicing the DNA, taking out a piece, putting in another one, gluing it together somehow. So we imagine that it's a very, very specific, very advanced process. Actually, that's not the case right now. Right now, it's a lot of just hit and miss trial. So the way that they're creating the GMO plants that we are consuming now, for example, with the potato, is they will get cells of the potato that they want to alter, and then they get a tiny strand, the gene, that they want to incorporate into that cell, and this gene comes from another plant, and they basically take a really powerful gun and shoot millions of these little tiny genes at the potato cells. And so some of these genes are going to hit the DNA and knock out a piece and get stuck in there. Some of them are going to miss completely, so it doesn't always work, but in that process, they always successfully incorporate that little gene that they want in a certain amount of the potato cells. And so then in a laboratory, they grow these potato cells and reproduce them, and eventually they can test which of the cells were successful or not. But it's not a very precise science, it's a lot of hit and miss. And that brings to the front that because it's a very uncontrolled process, some of these genes are creating mutations, possibly, that we aren't aware of. Or what part of the DNA are they knocking out and replacing? We don't always know. And so the long-term effects and the different side effects that it can have are unknown and very, very varied in possibilities. So that's also, because this process is so new, there's just a lot of things that we don't know. But that's how they do it. So today there's two main types of GMOs in our food. The first one is a herbicide-resistant crop. And so what happened is they have, this one is done specifically by Monsanto. There's other companies that are involved also in GMOs, but Monsanto's maybe the best known. They have a product called Roundup, which is a pesticide. And so they will spray that in the fields that they want, and it kills weeds. It's a very powerful pesticide. And what they found was that there was a part of a field close to the plant where they produced it, where they tested, where there were weeds that weren't dying. And so they figured, there must be something in this weed that resists the Roundup. So they took it into the lab, they tested it. Sure enough, they found the gene in this weed that was resistant to Roundup, and they spliced it out. And so they took corn and they shot these little genes into the corn and created the Roundup resistant corn. So that's the first one, herbicide resistant crop. So you could pour as much Roundup as you want on the plant and it's never gonna die. So you can spray as much Roundup as you want on this GMO corn and it's never gonna die. The second type of GMO is pesticide producing crop. So in the pesticide producing crop, there is a protein in most plants that is actually a pesticide. And they've done a lot of experiments and they understand how it works on a very basic level. So basically this plant, if the leaves get eaten, so if there's a lot of holes in the leaves, the plant creates this signal that causes it to produce this specific protein, which is a pesticide. Because the plant is just defending itself. It says, okay, there's a caterpillar or some insect on me that's eating my leaves. I'm going to create this tiny pesticide. And when the caterpillar or insect comes and eats more of the plant, it gets this protein pesticide in its stomach, and it causes it to explode. So the stomach of the insect explodes, killing the insects. So this is a natural thing. This exists in nature. That's the process. It's a way for plants to defend themselves. So what they've done is they've taken the gene that produces this protein, and they've inserted it in another food, potato or corn or soy, but they've altered it in two ways. Number one is that it's always on. So instead of it just being produced if it's being eaten by insects, it's always being produced. And because it's always being produced, it's at a much, much higher level than it would ever be found in nature. Millions of times higher. So for the insect, it's deadly right away. So the plant doesn't need to wait for its leaves to get eaten to produce it. It's always producing it. And it's producing it at much, much, much higher levels. So if the insects come and eat it, they die right away. So that is the pesticide producing crop. The plant itself is producing a pesticide which is natural, but in much, much higher quantities than it's ever been found in nature. Then there's a third type of GMO which hasn't been released on the market, but it's been developed, and they're trying to get it released now, and that's a fast-growing salmon. So it's a salmon that's grown, in pools, and I've seen pictures of it, and it's almost twice as big as regular salmon. So it's much, much bigger, and it grows that fast in 6 months. Whereas a regular salmon, I don't know exactly, but maybe 2 years for a full-grown salmon, and then you catch it and eat it. So this salmon is full-grown in 6 months, and it's almost twice as big. So, they say, well, it's going to produce a lot more food for us to eat, and the question is it healthy? Because if it just produces more food, that's great, but is it healthy for us to eat? That hasn't been approved, but that's why I went ahead and put it on so that you know that that's a GMO a type of GMO that's possibly coming, and it's being developed not only with salmon, but a lot of other things as well. So there's a lot of GMO products that aren't released yet. They have tomatoes, they have oranges, tons of stuff, but we'll see the list of the things that have been released. So now that we're talking about Monsanto, the question I pose is Monsanto a trustworthy company? And I guess that same question could be posed of any company. Is General Electric a trustworthy company? Is American Airlines a trustworthy company? But for our specific topic, I am asking the question, is Monsanto a trustworthy company? And it becomes an issue because we're actually giving them, as the United States, as the people of the United States, through our government, we're giving them a lot of responsibility that I think maybe we shouldn't. So let's take a look at Monsanto and what their history has been. In 1929, Monsanto began the sales of PCBs. Now PCBs are basically similar to oil. So oil is a natural product we get from the earth, but PCBs are created in the lab, but they have a lot of the same properties as oil, except that it can withstand much higher temperatures. So for example, if you're creating the wheels for a train, which have a lot of pressure, creates a lot of heat, it needs to be oiled all the time. Some oils will burn up at a certain temperature. PCBs have the advantage that they can withstand a tremendous amount of temperatures. So the industrial world, when they came out, thought this is wonderful. PCBs are gonna give us a lot of solutions to a lot of problems that we have in the mechanical and industrial worlds. So they released it, it's a lubricant basically, but in 1979 it was banned by Congress, and it was banned because it's so tremendously toxic. Not only, you know, to the touch if you have it on your hands, but just in the environment. Yeah?
No, I was just here.
So, you know, how long did it take us to learn that? About 50 years. You know, so we were polluting our environment for 50 years before we realized, whoops, we've made a mistake. PCBs are really terrible. Let's get them out of our environment. Not only that, but in 2003, Monsanto was fined $700 million for poisoning the citizens of Anniston, which is where lots of their PCBs were produced. So that city where the plant was, there's a lot of birth defects, very high cancer rates. It's really, really terrible. And, you know, the people in the city, after many years, started realizing there's something wrong. You know, why are we all so sick? So they took Monsanto to court, and in the trial, it was found that Monsanto knew very, very early on that PCBs were toxic, and they did nothing about it. And so the judge decided, yes, if you knew that information, then you had the responsibility to warn people at least, to, you know, set up some kind of safety precautions, but they didn't. They were interested in making a lot of money, so they were fined $700 million. $600 million were given to the people of the city, divided among all those that were sick, and $100 million was put to helping clean up the environment. So the rivers had to go through a cleaning process, and, you know, the city in general and where the plant was. So that happened in 2003. If we look at the second example, in 1944, Monsanto began manufacturing DDT, which is an insecticide, which was also used many, many years in the United States in all kinds of farms and agriculture in general. In 1972, it was banned by Congress, also because it is so tremendously toxic. Okay. So in 1944, Monsanto began manufacturing DDT, an insecticide. In 1972, it was banned because it's toxic. Same story. How long did it take us this time? 30 years. We're getting better, but that's really not good enough, I think, at least not for my standards. In 1960, Monsanto produced Agent Orange, and it was one of 15 different companies that were producing it for the US military, because they wanted to use it in Vietnam. Basically, Agent Orange, if you spray it on the plant, the leaves of the plant fall off, and that kills the plant, because without its leaves, it can't grow. And they thought that that's all it did, and so it was safe for humans. You know, if you spray it in a field where there's American soldiers, that's fine, because it's just gonna kill the plants. And then many years later, in 1971, not so much later, it was banned for home use, but years later they figured, wow, why are all of our soldiers coming back with so many problems? And they did tests, and Agent Orange is also tremendously toxic. So Monsanto has shown us that there's a history of, one, them producing very, very toxic chemicals. That's what they are, they're a chemical company, so it's not such a mystery. But number two, that they do not always tell the truth. When they know that something is very toxic, they do not tell the public, which a responsible company should do. So, and they're not the only ones, but so why does the US government not regulate Monsanto products more carefully? If we've seen this happen again and again, then you would think the US government would say, well, obviously something's wrong, we need to be a lot more careful, we need to regulate them. Well, that's a good question, and the answer is very, very complex, but this can give us a little bit of insight into what the problem is. So Michael Taylor, he's a very, very well-known lawyer, and his first position in his career was with the FDA. So he was a lawyer for the FDA. His goal was to help regulate food and drug in the United States. But then he left the FDA and he joined a law firm, and this law firm was hired by Monsanto, and he was specifically chosen to work for Monsanto as their food and drug law attorney. So Monsanto was working, or Michael Taylor was working specifically for Monsanto in all of their food and drug cases, and creating policy and making public statements, anything that related to their development of food or drugs. So it's a topic that he learned very, very much about. In 1991, he moved over to the FDA, and they created a position at that time called Deputy Commissioner for Policy. And this position was basically responsible for creating a policy statement for the United States about how it was going to deal with genetically modified foods. Because in the 90s is really when it started coming out. So the FDA said, well, we need to create a position, we need to have a policy of how we're going to deal with genetically modified foods. And so he was given the position as Deputy Commissioner. He was co-author with a couple other people in writing this policy, and unfortunately, the policy is very, very unregulated. So the FDA policy on GMOs, which came out in 1992, has very little regulation. And this was something that Ronald Reagan was pushing in the 80s. He believed very much in advancing technology and genetically modifying things to help improve our lives. Same thing with the first Bush administration, also pushing this very much. So it was kind of in the air that we want to deregulate these industries, we want to make it easy for the process to go on to create advancements. And so what they decided was, we are going to leave the testing and the determining whether it's safe or not to the company. We, the FDA, are not going to butt in. So if Monsanto is creating this product, then we trust them to do the testing necessary and to determine whether it's safe before they put it out in the public. So that is what's wrong. That the FDA actually kind of washed their hands of any responsibility and said, we're going to let the companies do it. So if you want a good business idea, here it is, because there's very little regulation. So the field is open. But what ends up happening is that we become, as a society, a testing ground for these products that are not regulated, that have not really been tested appropriately. And if you look at what the tests that Monsanto have done about GMOs, they're very incomplete tests. When scientists who know about testing look at them, they say, well, there's certain conclusions you can draw from this test, but it's not really thorough enough to say that it's safe for human consumption. So not only that, but in 1998, a group of very responsible citizens and lawyers and scientists got together and decided to sue the FDA because they felt, we believe the FDA is in cahoots with these chemical companies. There's tremendous amounts of money going into lobbying. There are gifts given out. There's money for campaigns. It's very difficult to know exactly who's who. And just like Michael Taylor went from Monsanto to the FDA, back to Monsanto, back to the FDA, there's maybe 20 plus examples of people, of other people doing the same exact thing. So there is this kind of revolving door between Monsanto and the FDA. And it happens with other companies as well. So, but in any case, there was a group of people that decided to sue the FDA. And what it brought to light was that the FDA had plenty of records showing that the scientists whose job it is to look at these things and give suggestions, they believed that GMOs were not yet proven safe for public use. So these scientists working for the FDA with their knowledge were not in agreement that these things were safe for public use. However, it's not the FDA's responsibility to determine that. And so these scientists, they would just make statements saying, they'd write emails to Monsanto saying, well, we've looked through the tests that you did and we do not consider them good enough to prove that it's safe for humans to consume. So we recommend that before you release them to the public, you do further testing. And these statements were ignored, and these emails were never made public. The FDA never said, we have made recommendations that Monsanto is not following. The FDA never fines Monsanto for not abiding by their suggestions. But all of these things came to light, and it was very, very clear that the scientists at the FDA were not in agreement that these things should be released. And they won. But what was most interesting about this was that all of this was made public in the case. And so all of a sudden we could see that there was plenty of documentation in the FDA where they were saying this is not ready for public release. And however, Monsanto and other companies did release it. So there is a lot of shadiness going on. So there are two major independent studies that have been done, which is very important to take a look at because these studies have not been influenced by the industry's money. So these were completely independent. The first one was basically paid for by the European Union. And the second one was sponsored by the University of Caen in France. So the first one, this scientist, Dr. Arpad Pusztai, was chosen to do this study because he is the world specialist in this protein lectin. And this protein lectin is this toxic protein I was telling you that if insects eat it, it kills them. So they were studying the potato that has been modified so that it produces this protein all the time and in high amounts so that if any insect tries to eat this plant, it dies. So he was chosen because he is a specialist on that specific protein, lectin. So they obviously chose well. And he was given about $3 million US, and he was told by the EU Commission, we want you to study this potato, and we want you to give us a statement that we will use for the EU on regulation of this GMO potato. So he did the study, And when he came out with the results, it was very, very clear. The GMO potato is not safe for human consumption. He basically, so he came out with that statement. You know, people were very happy, at least to know that, okay, we're following a good recommendation. This guy has done a good study. Basically what happened is 2 days after he came out with the results were taken back. He was fired from a job he had had for 30 years. And Monsanto came out with a statement saying, we don't believe the results of Dr. Ustai's research. We think it's faulty. We think it's not really a good research study. So it's, you know, there's lots of things we don't know. In any case, that whole issue is called the Ustai affair. And he never got his job back. He's from Hungary, so eventually he went back to Hungary and he's now living there with his wife. He's gotten countless prizes. He got there's a German Peace Prize. He got that. He's gotten lots of prizes from research organizations. But in England, nobody wants to know anything of him, at least in the university where he was and the government that was over him. So it's a little bit strange. You know, you can't jump to conclusions and say Monsanto had everything to do with him getting fired. We don't know. But it's very strange that when his results come out, then all of a sudden he's fired. The second study is Giles Eric Seralini, and he's a molecular biologist at the University of Caen in France. And oddly enough, when his study is done, guess what happens? Same exact thing. He's sued by Monsanto and said that his research is not valid and that he shouldn't be publishing this information because it's not accurate. So he also got fired. He now runs an organization which is basically fomenting independent scientific study. So they don't want to be attached to any university, they don't want to be attached to any government or any profit organization, because they know that obviously you're influenced. So he's got a wonderful website and they take donations. What they're trying to foment is independent scientific study. So, but his study was very interesting. He was studying the Roundup resistant corn, and he found that he did a 2-year study in rats because rats live about 2 years. So he wanted to do a full lifespan study. And what he found was in about half that time, by half of the life of the rats, 1 year, the rats that had been fed the Roundup resistant corn had tremendous amount of tumors. The males had tumors mostly in their livers, kidney, and the females had tumors mostly in the mammary glands. So that was the result of his. And the same thing, the Seralini affair is the whole deal that went on after he published his results. So an interesting fact is, if we don't look at science and what they have to say, if we look at nature and what it has to say, they've done this experiment many, many, many times. If you take two corns, and one is GMO and one is non-GMO, and you put it out in nature, and the squirrels come and they eat the corn, they will choose the non-GMO corn and eat up that whole corn, and the other one has been slightly munched on, tasted, but it's pretty much still there after a full day out in nature. So if you want to trust animals and their common sense, then they're possibly saying that real food is somehow better than non-GMO. Whether it's one can conclude that it's toxic for us humans because the animals don't eat it, but common sense should say, well, if I can choose non-GMO over GMO, I should. There's also a neuroscientist who has already passed away, Andres Carrasco, and he did a very, very in-depth study in Argentina with embryos. That was his specialty. And he did a study with GMOs and embryos and found that eating GMO affected the development of the embryos, caused birth defects, all kinds of terrible things. Guess what happened to him? Exact same story. And unfortunately, the list goes on, and it's not only abroad. He was in Argentina, that's happened in France, that's happened in England, but even in the United States, there's cases where people are doing studies, they release their results, they get fired from their jobs, they get sued by Monsanto or other corporations. So it's a sad story. Obviously, it's a very powerful company, and they have very big interests, economic interests in keeping their product out in the market. But the real question is it safe for us or not? At least we, the people, want to know that, and we still don't know. So is Roundup Ready linked to breast cancer? The French study by Serlini, that's what he concluded. He concluded the female rats are getting mammary tumors. I would conclude that women are getting breast cancer in very high amounts, in part because of GMO in the food. So it's not conclusive, but that was one of his comments in his study. Is Roundup Ready linked to birth defects? That is what Andres Carrasco said in his study, in the results of his study. He said when he studied the embryos, the ones where he found traces of Roundup, they were born with birth defects. They had slower development. The embryos that there were no trace of Roundup were healthy, natural embryos and born well. So again, not conclusive, but that's what the scientists are telling us. Are lectin genes in GMOs linked to allergies? So this is something that's starting to come up very, very much. Again, it's not conclusive, but it's very interesting. So what this lectin does in the insects is it actually explodes the stomach of the insect. That is how the insect dies. Not because it's a toxic substance, it actually creates a miniature explosion which blows up the stomach of the insect dies. So what they're starting to talk about as a hypothesis is now that we're eating this GMO, which has this lectin gene, it's actually creating miniature explosions in our stomach and digestive tract, which obviously doesn't kill us because we're much, much bigger, but they are finding that a lot of people have leaky guts. They have holes in their intestine, and there's no explanation yet to where these holes come from. Now that's a problem because our intestine is supposed to be completely closed off. And we're supposed to process food, break it down, and then there's certain paths that do lead to our blood. So once everything's been broken down and the proteins and amino acids are in their smallest form, then it's released into the body. But what's happening is miniature pieces of not completely processed broccoli are leaving our intestinal tract and going out into our system. And all of a sudden, our body says, what's this foreign substance? I don't know broccoli in this form. Not outside of the gut. What's it doing over here by the liver? And so, all of a sudden the body says, emergency, there's a foreign substance we need to attack it, we need to get it out of the body. Well, what ends up, what the hypothesis is that is the reason for all of these allergies that are coming about all the time. If we go back to the 1940s, allergies were very, very few. It really wasn't a medical problem. But now, there's allergies to everything. People can be allergic to parsley, something that's completely natural. People are allergic to flour, to rice, to potatoes, to you name it. So it's interesting, it's very easy to explain why we're allergic to chemicals or to dust. It's something outside that is not supposed to go into our body. But when we start becoming allergic to food, like broccoli, like parsley, like rice, then we need to question something is wrong. And the theory is we're starting to, because of the lectin in the food, we're starting to get miniature holes in our gut. It's leaking out into our system. Our system is reacting as an emergency that this is foreign, and so our body develops an allergy to that item that was found outside of the gut. Again, this isn't conclusive, but there's a lot of people talking about this theory. And hopefully they'll do studies and we'll know better. But it's a scary thought. So our body's immune system is designed to identify foreign objects and get rid of it. That is one of the purposes of our immune system. Which is why when there's a heart transplant, many times there's a failure because the body does not identify certain substances in this heart and rejects it. So it is still debated whether GMOs are unidentifiable by our immune system and thus treated as foreign objects causing inflammation. So corn has been in nature for millions and millions of years. And our bodies have developed the knowledge that corn is in the system, that if we eat corn, it's healthy to eat. But we don't know if this GMO corn, because it's completely new to our environment, if our body accepts it as regular corn or identifies it as a foreign substance and thus tries to get it out of our system, creating inflammation. So this is another question that's still debated. We don't know. Hopefully, in 10 years of research, we will know, and we'll be able to better decide whether we should be eating GMO foods or not. So with all of these questions and all of these unknowns, what are other governments doing? What are other countries doing? In Russia, the government has recommended to ban all GMOs for at least 10 years. Why 10 years? They say we don't know enough. We're not going to say GMOs are good. We're not going to say GMOs are bad. We hope in 10 years we have more information and thus can then decide. This is a very interesting story. In Haiti, after the earthquake, there was complete devastation. People were starving to death. And Monsanto very generously offered to send 475 tons of seed to Haiti so that they could plant it, grow, and feed their people in this disaster. And the farmers of Haiti gathered together and said, if that seed arrives here in Haiti, we're going to burn it up. We do not want it. They had a huge demonstration and they created this huge bonfire as a symbol that do not send that seed because this is what we're going to do to it. We're going to burn it up. It's interesting, that people even in a dire situation, farmers who maybe have more knowledge than we do about what is healthy or not, reject that so strongly. Over 60 countries around the world have restrictions or outright bans on the production and sale of GMOs. Over 60 countries. Australia, absolutely no GMOs. Completely banned. Japan, the same thing. All of the European Union, they have a ban on any GMO that's for food. They do grow GMO potatoes to make paper, but not for human consumption. And I don't know if on their paper it says do not eat. In the United States, Hawaii and Oregon are setting an example. They ban GMOs. So in Oregon, you can't grow anything that's GMO. In Hawaii, I think it's a complete ban. You can't sell it and you can't grow it. So fortunately, there are people leading a healthy example. And really, we can't conclude that GMOs are bad for us. We don't know. I don't believe in sensationalism. If you watch GMO documentaries, they're going to brainwash you and make you think that GMOs are the devil incarnate. We don't know. So don't be afraid. A GMO, I went to this lecture and now I'm so scared because GMOs is the worst thing in the world.
Well, almost.
We don't know. We don't know.
You might get fired.
We won't
Does
tell.
anybody here work for Monsanto?
Didn't ask that.
So, but my recommendation as a chef, I work with food every single day and I study nutrition, I watch documentaries, I read books. I'm very, very into what is happening day to day with our food. As a chef, my recommendation is, because we don't know enough and the things that we tend to see are dangerous enough, my recommendation is avoid GMOs. But don't be extremists. If you go to a friend's party and they've made a wonderful dinner, don't say, well, is all of this GMO? Because otherwise I can't.
How would we know?
How do you know?
Well, exactly. We'll come to that. So, but I don't believe in being extremist. Our bodies are made to withstand a certain amount of abuse. They are made to clean themselves. So minimize the amount of GMOs you are consuming, definitely. But don't be extremist. One should take more caution with people, with children, with people who are elderly, or anybody who's sick. If you're recovering from cancer, for example, definitely stay away from GMOs. But if you're young and healthy, then maybe it's okay to have it from time to time. So how do we avoid GMOs? The first thing we can do is buy certified organic. So if something has a label that says certified organic, then we know it's non-GMO. Then there is another option, which is buying things that are labeled non-GMO certified. So there is a nonprofit organization that is formed. It's not run by the government, but they're trying to set an example for what we would like the government to be doing. And it's an organization that certifies that things have been produced with all non-GMO products. They have a label that looks like this, and it says non-GMO project verified. It's got the little butterfly. So that's another way that we can know it's non-GMO. Then third, we can avoid certain danger items, and I'll talk about this in just a second. But there's some items that are more dangerous and we should avoid them. And then fourth, we should avoid all processed foods. So in processed foods, there are so many ingredients it's impossible to know if some of them are GMO or not. And most processed foods have tons of soy, sugar, corn, and those items are mostly GMO. So we should just avoid all processed foods. So let's take a look at our danger items. First, we have soy and corn, which mostly all the soy and corn in the United States, for the most part, is GMO. So it's hard to find soy or corn that isn't GMO. If you are going to buy it, you have to buy certified organic. That way you know it's a non-GMO
food. Then there's the golden potato, which has recently been approved and is going to be used by, for example, McDonald's. So French fries are now going to be, at McDonald's at least, are now going to be GMO because the golden potato is now been approved as a GMO food. So if you want to avoid GMO, then don't buy golden potato. Buy Idaho potato, buy red potato, fingerling, purple potato. All of those are fine. But with the golden potato, you can't know unless you're buying specifically certified organic. Cottonseed is grown mostly for oil. So if you find a oil that says, for example, vegetable oil, chances are it contains cottonseed, which is GMO. So just avoid oils that are generic, that say just vegetable oil. Same thing with canola oil. Most of the canola oil in the United States contains GMO, is made with GMO canola. Then we have the sugar beet. Most sugar in the United States, contrary to popular belief, is not made from sugar cane, but from the sugar beet. And it's largely produced as a GMO product now. So if you want to buy sugar that's non-GMO, you have to find one that on the package says sugar from sugar cane, or it'll also say certified organic, and that way you know that it's a non-GMO sugar product. Then we have the papaya. It's also now grown as a GMO product, and we can't know unless we buy certified organic. And zucchini as well. And finally, the crookneck yellow squash is a GMO product. So if you're looking to buy the crookneck yellow squash, it has to have a label that says certified organic. Otherwise, you don't know if it's GMO or not. And that concludes today's topic.
I went over, unfortunately, so I'm going to, unfortunately, not have question and answers. If you do have a question, you can catch me afterwards, but I'm going to give Rajni the floor and go warm up the food.
Thank you.